We talked last evening about the fact that it seems that the church has either been intimidated or just unaware of how we can help individuals come into a good, healthy walk with Jesus. We started with the premise last night that the church seems to be, at least it's my experience, that we seem to be more proficient at helping people come into a personal relationship with Jesus, people able to get saved, than we are helping those same people become sanctified, grow in their ability to reflect who Jesus has called them to be. And I recognize that none of us this side of heaven are going to fully experience that sanctification, that transformation. But certainly it's God's intent and it's His desire that we are in a constant state of growth, a constant state of becoming more and more conformed into His image. But as I said, the church has either failed to understand how we can come alongside others and help them along in that process, or I think probably what has happened also is that the church has become intimidated, that with the development of all the experts and professionals in areas of counseling, psychology, and so on, we've become intimidated in thinking that it's not really our role to deal with the significant issues of life. I mean, who are we as just ordinary Christians to be able to help people who are suffering from depression or anxiety or an addiction or an eating disorder? That's something that we need to refer out to those professionals and those experts that have special training. And because of this culture in which we live that is very keen and fond of experts for everything, you can have, you have experts that deal with just about any topic. The average individual just sort of backs off and abdicates his role, and we abdicate our calling to come alongside others, helping them to grow and to become who Christ has called us and called them to be. So what I want to do today is I want to reclaim together with you what is rightfully ours. I want to look at what the Scriptures say as to what our role is and what God offers us in order to overcome the issues of sin and overcome the issues of traumas that we may experience in life, and learn how we can just be used by Him to help others, and also how we can deal with those very same issues in our own lives. I talked last night about how the goal of the Christian life needs to be more than simply managing sin, simply trying to keep the springs down in the mattress, keep the issues from showing and affecting our lives and affecting other people's lives. That God didn't call us just to make do and manage sin in this life, but in fact what He wants us to do is learn how to deal with the effects of living in a broken world, in a fallen world with fallen human beings and fallen bodies. Learn how to deal with living in this fallen and broken world biblically and in cooperation with the power of the Holy Spirit, so we're in a never-ending process of change and transformation. Now, I want to make clear that what we're going to be talking about today is not a counseling model, if you will. It's not just some technique that we can develop and use to help each other. It's not... nor is it prayer ministry. We're not talking primarily about prayer ministry or a way in which we can engage in prayer ministry to fix ourselves and fix each other. Because the reason why it's not just prayer ministry is that what we're talking about, what we're dealing with, is the effects of living in this fallen world and the effects of having our own broken lives, our own flesh, our own sinful nature. And one of the things that we need to be clear about is that the Scriptures don't teach that you can pray out the effects of the flesh, that you can just simply pray for a person or deliver a person from their flesh. Overcoming the flesh is a process, according to Paul in the book of Romans, overcoming the flesh is a process of putting on Christ and putting off the flesh. It's something that we walk out, and it's not something that can occur simply in a prayer session. So the only reason I say that is that oftentimes people are assuming that what we're talking about with the application of the gospel of wholeness is some kind of prayer ministry training. And though prayer certainly is going to have a major part in our understanding of how to move on with Christ, this isn't a model where we would have 2 or 3 people get together with somebody who is experiencing some area of brokenness and lay hands on them and pray healing or pray wholeness into them. That would be lovely, but I don't think that's how we fix the flesh. We fix the flesh, if you will, by learning how to walk after Christ and pursue Him, and allowing the Holy Spirit to be giving us that ability to walk in the authority and the power that He's given us to more and more consistently walk out of the flesh and in the Spirit. So we're not talking about a technique, we're not talking about a prayer ministry model. Really what the gospel of wholeness is, and you'll hear me say this over and over again, is it's just the theology of what a normal Christian life ought to be. It's not anything apart from just biblical Christianity 101. How we learn to live in a way that reflects the calling and the purposes that Christ has for us. How we learn to cooperate with the work and the power of the Holy Spirit. How we learn to recognize those things that we are surrendering to, that causes us to not be yielded to Christ as we should. So, what we're addressing is just a clear, practical, effective model, what the Scriptures say about living the normal Christian life. And that is the understanding that I have in what I'm presenting. So we're going to go over the remainder of this day, we're going to go over 8 different verses. And as I said last night, the verses that I've chosen, we could use other verses if we wish, but the verses I chose, I believe, just come together and give us a good understanding of how to succinctly explain and identify that process of sanctification, that process of becoming like Christ. So the first verse that I want us to look at, just to build a foundation, is in Genesis chapter 3, verses 6 through 12 or 13. Okay, and this is a real familiar passage. Let me go ahead and read it to you out loud. It says, "When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. And she also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it. And then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized that they were naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man, 'Where are you?' And he answered, 'I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid.' And he said, 'Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?' And the man said, 'The woman who you put here with me, she gave me from the fruit of the tree, and I ate it.'" Well, here we have just a wonderful description of where things went wrong. We have a picture of the fall. And what I want us to understand as a foundation of the gospel of wholeness is that sin must be addressed. This issue of sin, this issue of what occurred in the garden, it has to be addressed. So, and by the way, as we're going through my outline, if I forget to give you a word to fill in the blank, just raise your hand and I'll try to make sure I get that to you. But sin must be addressed in both salvation and sanctification. Just as this issue of sin is the core issue of that has to be addressed in salvation, we need to, in order to be saved, learn how it is that we are to deal with that sin, or how Jesus dealt with sin. When we're dealing with sanctification, we're talking about sin as well. So that is where we're headed today. And I want us to understand that if the problem is not totally the result of physiology, and it's not totally the result of the demonic, then sin has to be the issue. In other words, if we're trying to help somebody and they're not just dealing with the results of some physiological problem, some physical problem in the body, and if it's not totally and absolutely all due to some demonic issue, then the other alternative is sin. So my bias here, and I want you to understand it, is I believe quite often when we're ministering to people in their brokenness, there usually will be some influence of demons that we need to address and we can pray about and break the power of those spirits. I think there are a few situations that we can legitimately say, this is just a demon, that's all it is. This person's problem, their depression, their anxiety, their addiction, it's just a demon that's making them do it. I think it's not always, I think it's 99.9% of the time cooperation of their flesh with some spirit. So even if there's a spirit that's involved, my assumption is we still are going to have to deal with the issue of sin, their choice to give over to the flesh. And though I would recognize there may be some situations where a person chemically or physiologically are given to depression or anxiety, even there I think that it's rare that it's all physiological, it's all chemical. I still think there's a considerable amount of meshing. So apart from something that would be totally demonic or totally physiological, I believe the common factor that we see in Scripture, and that is addressed here in Genesis chapter 3, is sin. So when we consider what the first foundational verse is and key for the gospel of wholeness, the phrase that I want you to remember is the common problem. And the common problem would be sin. Incidentally, in your outlines, I think it's page 18, perhaps it's page 18, there's a chart, is that right? Do I have the right page? So that will give you both the verse, then the key concept, and then the scripture. So the key concept for Genesis chapter 3 is what? The common problem, which is sin. So in other words, when somebody comes in to talk to me or they give me a call on the phone, they say, I need to talk to you, there's some things in my life that are going on that I have to talk about. As they walk into my office, before they open their mouth, before they even say a word, I already have a certain presupposition that we're going to be talking about sin. We're going to be talking about their sin, or we're going to be talking about sins committed against them, or we're going to be talking about their sinful response to sins committed against them. But I recognize that's the common problem. If there wasn't the fall, we wouldn't need counselors, we wouldn't need disciplers, we wouldn't need peer counselors, we wouldn't need a gospel of wholeness. But it's because of sin that we have to address all these issues. Now, as I said, we often are going to be dealing either with our own sins or we're going to be dealing with sins committed against us. In other words, my sinful reactions. How many of us grew up in a situation perhaps or have been in relationships where we see that we may be treated in an inappropriate way, but we also, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, have to recognize that we're reacting sinfully to this sin that's committed against us. And it's real important that we understand that, because if we're going to be whole and healthy people, we can't just say, well, I'm going to deal with the other person's sin. And we can't just say, I'm going to deal with my own sin. We're also going to deal with our reactions, our interactions with other people. Now, in Genesis chapter 3, what we read about there is that we see that as sin entered the world, it affected the world, and it affected us in three different ways. It affected us upwardly and outwardly and then also inwardly. In other words, upwardly with God, when sin entered the world, we saw something occur that forever changed things in regards to a person's relationship with God. Before sin came into the world, in Genesis, in the garden, there was perfect communion with Adam and Eve and their God. They walked in the garden, they just chatted and talked, and there was right connection. But what happened after sin came into the world? What happened after the fall? All of a sudden, God comes into the garden, and what do Adam and Eve do? They hide. You know, here comes God, and Adam and Eve are hiding in the garden. Jesus, comes and recognizes something has tragically changed. So when sin comes and has its effect, one of the areas that is forever fractured that we need to understand, and we'll be addressing this a little bit later, is in our relationship with God. Our relationship with God is torn, it's fractured, and it's forever changed, and therefore it needs to begin to be addressed. And in our relationship with one another, with each other, we also see that because of the fall, something has been changed and will have to be addressed by the gospel, if you will. And that is that before sin came into the world, before the fall, Adam and Eve were also in perfect communion. They agreed on things. They had common values and common vision and common priorities. They knew that their role was to not only enjoy their relationship with God, but enjoy their relationship with each other. You know, Eve would come up to Adam on weekends and say, Adam, it's been a long week. You just go ahead and kick back, watch a football game. And, Adam would say, Eve, thank you. Here's a couple of credit cards. Why don't you go into, things were fine. Things were good between them. There was no conflict. There was no frustration, because there was one will, if you will. There was one will in the universe, and it was God's. And Adam and Eve shared his will, his purpose, his desire, the direction that he had for their lives. But when the fall occurred, we see that fracture take place, that we see something occur in their relationship with each other. And all of a sudden, God comes, and says, what is this that's going on here? What's happened? And where there was perfect communion up to that point, all of a sudden, we see something broken here. Adam says, listen, this woman, who incidentally you gave me, she gave me from the tree. What we see is, rather than the consistency of will and unity of spirit, we see a fracturing in the relationship between man and woman, between human beings and each other. Disunity, we see blame shifting. But we also see it affect one other area. Not only does it affect their relationship with God and their relationship with others, but we also see it affected and it fractured their own attitude and their relationship with themselves, if you will. Before the fall, it says that they were naked in the garden and unashamed. In other words, figuratively and literally, they had nothing to hide. They felt perfectly comfortable with themselves. It was all there for anyone to see who they were, what they were, and they were fine with that. And then after the fall, we see something very different. The fall occurs, and all of a sudden, they're no longer naked and unashamed. They're sewing together fig leaves, trying to cover something up. And I think intuitively, they understood there's something wrong. There's something that we need to hide. There's something damaged about me that I don't want to be apparent to other people. And they did the only thing they could think of doing is, if we can sew these fig leaves together, perhaps we can hide or cover up the shame that we feel, not recognizing that the shame was internal. It was because they recognized that the purpose and the way in which we are created has been fractured. It can't be covered physically, but that was the only solution, or the only source of a solution they could think of. So suffice it to say, sin is the common problem that we have to deal with, because it affects our lives in every relational area. It affects how we relate to God. It fractures that relationship. It affects how we relate to each other and brings a fracturing in that relationship. And it also affects how we see and relate to ourselves. So the good news that we need to discover in the Scriptures has to address all three of those areas if it's going to be effective. It has to be able to address our relationship with God. It has to be able to address our relationship with others. And it must address our relationship and how we view and see ourselves. And if it can do that, then indeed it's good news, because it would address all these areas of brokenness, both eternally, and the gospel does affect how we relate to God, others, and ourselves eternally, but we want to discover how can it bring about change in this life? How can it begin to change our relationship with God, others, and ourselves here and now? Now, the poverty of the secular approach to counseling is that it fails to address the core problem of sin. And therefore, the results gained from the secular approach are going to either be temporary or external only. So in other words, if the core issue is sin, and secular counseling generally is uncomfortable talking about sin or dealing with sin because they don't want to make people feel guilty or feel bad about themselves, then you can understand why we're going to be leaving people undone in coming up with any solution for them. And in the world in general right now, and the psychological world in general, talking about sin is definitely a no-no. You know, at best we'll talk about unhealthy behavioral patterns, poor life choices. But the problem is there's nothing in the Scriptures that I can find that says here's what to do about unhealthy behavior patterns. The Bible doesn't talk about poor life choices, but it talks a lot about sin. So you can understand if we all of a sudden separate ourselves from addressing or dealing with or looking at this issue of sin, that central rudimentary brokenness in our lives, if we don't want to address it, then there's little hope that we're going to be able to fix people. So as I mentioned before, one of the things that we need to recognize is when that person comes to talk to you, to talk to me, we can understand that before they even say a word, we could legitimately say, as a person comes into my office, I could say, don't say anything. I know what you want to talk about. It's sin. And I'd be right. That'd be correct. I wouldn't do that. Don't you do that? But that would be accurate, wouldn't it? We're dealing with sin, so we can't address that. And one of the concerns that I have as a pastor is there is so much technique out there in trying to deal with the basic issues of life. There's so many flaky non-Christians and flaky Christians who are trying to come up with clever little ways to fix ourselves and to fix each other. And most of them skirt this issue of wanting to talk about our sin, about our fallenness, about our flesh, about our brokenness. And therefore, like I said, at best, the solutions will be either temporary or just very external. We can change the outside. Someone gave me a book. Oh, actually, it's been about a year ago now, maybe even longer. But this book is called, this is great, it's called Big You, Little You. I won't read you the people who wrote it because I'm embarrassed for them. But here's a typical, and you will be too, but here's a typical technique-oriented approach. Now, basically, their whole premise, and these are both doctors or PhD candidates in the counseling area, But what they want to do is what they've set up is really everybody has this little child inside, that little boy, that little girl inside. This is a popular notion today. And they've just taken that to new heights. So what they do in order to help people get whole is they say, you need to learn to talk to yourself. Let that mature you, the big you, talk and help that little you with its fears and with its problems and with its hurts. And they give throughout the book different little dialogues between big you and little you and people they've counseled. So here's a big and little you conversation that they've noted here to give you an idea of how we can help people become whole in Christ. So this is a conversation going on in the mind and heart of this woman named Virginia. Big says, "What's the matter, Little?" Little says, "I want my mommy. Yes, I do. That's why I'm so bad, but I can never find her again. She's gone forever, and that's why I'm so sad." And Big says, "Well, it's true that she's gone, but the love she gave you, Little, will be a part of you forever." And Little says, "I guess you're right. I'll try to be better for you from now on, because I really do love you, Big. I love you too, Little, very much." It goes on. "You are such a good, sweet little girl, and I always will take care of you. And you can play and sing and dance and look at the trees. I know you love trees, Little." "I do love trees. I love the country too. You see, Mommy and Daddy and I lived in a beautiful house in the country, and it was summertime, and we had a good time then." And it goes on from there. Now, that's another option you might choose rather than the gospel of wholeness. But what we're dealing with is just a proliferation of technique-oriented counseling, where what we try to do is at its worst is trick a person into feeling better, or create an environment where it just seems a little easier, a little lighter, a little less problematic in their lives. But what we are failing to do in so many of these techniques is just talk about the common problem. What's the common problem? Sin. You're good. So what we're doing is we're just saying, what does the gospel say needs to be dealt with, and then we're going to see how we deal with it. As I said, to deal with these different kind of approaches, really it's temporary in that it has little real effect, and because it has no power for change. It just makes a person maybe feel better in the moment. Or it's external, meaning that it's from the outside in. It's oftentimes the approaches that people take is only trying to change the behavior. So therefore the person comes to you, they say that they're having a problem with anger. They're lashing out at their spouse, they're lashing out at their children, they're having conflict at the workplace with coworkers. So what we end up doing very frequently in our attempt to help others is we try to fix them from the outside in. We talk about, here are techniques, or here are better ways in order to communicate. Here's a better way in order to learn how to respond to your boss. Here's how I want you and your wife, you and your husband to interact. Now, those techniques are helpful. Don't get me wrong. It's very valuable when we're helping people to give them some instruction that they may not have learned just growing up in a healthy home, and to learn how to communicate. But if we want to be biblical Christians, if we want to talk about biblical Christianity, then we have to go beyond just helping people with techniques to change them from the outside in. Saying, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, for now on, when you're having a discussion, each of you need to have a pencil and take turns handing the pencil back and forth, and that's who gets to talk, and they have the floor. I mean, there's lots of techniques that are valuable. But if the core issue is sin, is selfishness, is the big, I want what I want, if the core issue is sin, then just simply handing them a pencil and teaching them a technique can bring an external change, and that's not all bad, but we as Christians, I believe, want to go further than that. We want to deal with what's underneath it, and not just bring about these techniques that can bring about external change. Does that make sense? So rather, for the person who is filled with anxiety, rather than only teaching them how to take deep breaths, and write down, all the good things that are happening through the day so they don't only look at all the negative things, rather than simply or only giving them the external tools to help things, we need to go a step deeper and say, now what is the cause? What's underneath this anxiety? Where is their faithlessness? Where do they doubt that God really, truly is a good God? Where have they failed to learn how to appropriate the power and the presence of God so they could find a peace of God that Philippians says goes beyond understanding, beyond comprehension? So the core issue that we have to deal with if we're going to truly become disciples of Christ is going to be sin. So if we are uncomfortable in talking about sin, there'll be little change. If we become counselors or see counselors who are unwilling to talk about sin, there'll be little real internal change. Because the change that the Scriptures talk about is always a change that resonates from the inside out, not just from the outside in. I mean, isn't that how you guys got saved? You didn't get saved by changing yourself from the outside in and then letting it sort of sink in. You didn't say, well, I want to get saved, so I'm going to start going to church. I'm going to carry a Bible with me, and I'm going to listen to certain music. And you didn't get saved by changing the externals and letting it filter down. You got saved, and your life was changed forever when you did get saved, because you partook of a gift that God was offering. The Holy Spirit did something supernaturally from the inside out, which resulted in change, but it's from the inside out. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Let me pause here. Are there any questions about this issue? And if you, just for the sake of our tape, if you have a question, I certainly do want to respond to it. I'm going to have to repeat it, so make it short and succinct if you could. Yes?
Danny, since sin is the issue, is there significance in counseling people who essentially have not accepted what Jesus has offered and essentially still have the corruptedness inside of them, and teaching them technique instead of dealing with the problem?
Great. Good question. The question is, if sin is the issue, where's the value in helping or counseling people who have not come into a relationship with Christ? They've not recognized that there is sin to be dealt with in their own life or whatever. Is there value in just helping them with techniques? And I guess the way I'd respond is, yeah, on one level there's value in helping someone just learn some techniques if they're not interested in going any further. I think as Christians, we can help one another, or help those that we may work with, or our relatives who may not have a relationship with Jesus. It can be a wonderful opportunity to help bring them closer, to help them to see the limit of just the technique approach, to the problems of life. So I think in counseling those who aren't Christians and those who don't accept what the Scriptures have to say, there's great opportunity to help them to see the reality of the Word and the truth of who Christ is. And I don't have a problem if they say, listen, I'm not interested in anything but learning how to communicate better with my wife or my husband. We can help them with that, but I think it's our responsibility to also let them know that this will only go so far, because it doesn't change us at a core level. It doesn't make us a different person. It makes us just the same old impatient, angry, broken person who just has learned some external ways to keep it under under wraps a little bit better, a little bit longer. Is that bad? No. But is that really what we should be aiming at? Hopefully not.
So for some people, if they start out not interested really in dealing with what we believe is the core problem, and after trying all this technique and seeing that it doesn't, their frustration or they can actually be a witnessing tool.
Oh, absolutely. It can be a witnessing tool that when we're counseling somebody and we begin by just addressing these external things, it oftentimes can result as a real tool for evangelism. Because remember last evening I talked about the devil's triangle, this, I think I can, I guess I can't, I give up. What will happen when we just deal with technique approach Christianity? We are just setting ourselves and others up for various treks through this devil's triangle where, okay, this time I'm going to deal with my anger. This time I'm going to deal with how I'm, the agitation I'm constantly exhibiting towards my family. I think I can. And then they go and they do fairly well and they've read some books and they learn some techniques, only to then all of a sudden come to the end where they just can't do it anymore. Their attempts collapse into a heap, and then they give up, only to read a new book, go to a new conference, or hear another sermon and get excited. This time I'll be able to do it. So a lot of times what I'm saying is that we'll see people who don't want to deal with it at a core level. They aren't interested in dealing with it as the scriptures call for us to. And they're the ones that they go out there, we give them some of the techniques, it gets better for a while, it collapses in on them again, and sometimes after 2 or 3 times going through that cycle, we've got their attention, that this is just going to be dealing with it from the external rather than from the internal, and sometimes it takes 2 or 3 laps around the wilderness to be convinced that there's a better idea. Any other questions, comments about just this first concept in the Gospel of Wholeness? Yes?
I've met a lot of friends who are married and they have issues with their spouses. And say, a lot of times we're praying for the husbands, they can discern what they need is, but a lot of times the door is shut.
Sure. Sometimes we're in a situation, comment is that we're in situations where we're trying to help somebody, maybe their spouse is unsaved. So we can't prevail on the unsaved spouse to change, but in those situations, certainly we can be praying for the unsaved spouse, and God is gracious and oftentimes beginning to work and maybe even capturing their hearts. But what we can do is we can deal with 2 things. We can deal with the spouse who is saved, the spouse that we're talking to. We can help them to learn how to, number one, not react in sinful ways towards the sin that may be expressed towards them, which is often the case. And we can help them also to not have the effect and the power of those things that are done to them or said to them have the controlling effect in their lives. We'll be talking about that this afternoon more, but we can certainly say to a person, and there's this great benefit and great value in recognizing that even if a person has an unsaved spouse who's just the most rotten guy, the most rotten woman you can imagine, we can tell the one who is walking with the Lord that their spouse's condition and behavior and attitude do not limit them one bit from being able to be pleasing to Christ day after day and to live in a way that God is calling them to live. It's not going to be a perfect marriage, but they can lay their head on a pillow every night and say, Jesus, to the best of my ability, I tried to be the wife, or I attempted to be the husband today that you have called me to be, and I believe to the best of my knowledge I honored you in what I did and what I said and how I responded. Does that mean we have a good marriage? No, we can't have a good marriage if one person isn't wanting to be faithful to be who you've called them to be. But we as that believing spouse, our ability is not diminished one bit in being able to live a godly life before God. And that's real important. that we give them that perspective. That for all of us, our goal in life it needs to first and foremost be, are we walking in a way pleasing to Jesus? You know, who's our audience? Is our audience other people in the church? Is our audience our spouse? Or is our audience Jesus? You know, do we live to be able to say, Jesus, I attempt to please and honor you? And in dealing and living with a world that is fallen, I'm not going to always be able to have peace and unity, but I can still walk in a way that is reflective of your purposes and your call for my life. Does that make sense? Good. Okay, why don't we go ahead and move on? Let's just review. The first verse is what? What's the verse? Genesis 3, 6 through 12, 13, somewhere around there. And what's the key phrase? The common problem. What is that common problem? Okay, so you're one eighth of the way there. Okay, why don't we go ahead and move on? Let's just review. The first verse is what? What's the verse? Genesis 3, 6 through 12, 13, somewhere around there. And what's the key phrase? The common problem. What is that common problem? Okay, so you're one eighth of the way there. All right, let's go on. Second verse is just a wonderful verse. It's really the cornerstone of the gospel of wholeness. Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 13. And here the prophet Jeremiah is speaking, prophesying, speaking the words of God. And what God is saying through Jeremiah in this verse is, my people have committed two sins. They've forsaken me, the spring of living water, and they've dug their own cisterns, but they're broken cisterns, and they can't hold water. So through Jeremiah, what God is saying is, listen, everyone, all of his creatures, all of his people have committed really two sins. We can summarize it, we can boil it down to two different sins. The first is they've abandoned me. In other words, he says, I'm the spring of life. I'm the one that provides life and hope and direction and purpose. It gives people a sense of being. I'm the one that brings that living water into their lives. But this first sin they've committed is they've turned from me. They're no longer trying to draw life, purpose, value, hope, peace, identity through the one who can give it. And what they've done, having turned from me, is they've turned around from the spring of life, the well of living water, and now they're beginning to dig these cisterns or these wells. But Jeremiah says they're empty wells. They're broken. They can't hold water. And this gives such a wonderfully accurate picture of every human being's condition. Every single one of us. That to one degree or another, having failed to either attempt to or to care about finding our life, our purpose, our identity, sense of being, our hope, our peace, our contentment from what God provides, we go ahead and begin to pursue counterfeit ways, these empty wells, trying to find life, trying to find peace, trying to find hope. You see, only God can call himself Yahweh. Only God can say, I am that I am. Only God finds his life, his identity, his value, his worth, his purpose, a sense of being from within himself. I am that I am. But for every one of us, it's different. Every one of us, what we can say is, I am because he is. Our identity, our value, our worth, our hope, our peace, our purpose doesn't come from within ourselves. It comes from him. So you can see the difficulty we're facing if what Jeremiah says is true, as it is, and we've abandoned the one who gives us life, the spring of living water, in order to try to find life through counterfeit means, we're in deep trouble. Because we've just separated ourselves from the source of what every one of us needs. As Christians, we say, I am because He is. Our value, worth, identity, purpose, security, hope, peace can come only from God. And we're in desperate shape as individuals if we've turned from Him and try to find those things elsewhere. Now, these broken cisterns that Jeremiah talks about, these broken cisterns are simply our sins of choice. And we all have them. We all have them. We could go around the room this morning and spend the rest of the day just talking about our broken cisterns. And as many people as there are in the room today, there can be that many different sins of choice that we have. Because the issue is not so much what is their particular sin of choice, what's the particular cistern that they've begun to dig, or that particular empty well that they've begun to dig. What's significant is that it's empty. And it's always going to be empty, and it can't provide what only God can give. The interesting thing also is every one of us looks with great disdain at other people's empty wells, you know, but understand fully and are extremely gracious and merciful as we consider our own. So somebody else is trying to find life out of their career, and we think, what a foolish thing! Doesn't he see what he's doing? You know, he is not going to find security and hope and peace in that career, no matter how high on the ladder he climbs. You know, he just doesn't see it. God is the only one that will give him that kind of security. In the meantime, we're trying to find security from some relationship. You know, trying to find life from our family, trying to find life from our role as a dad or as a mom. Trying to find life from people in the church. Are those things bad? No, not at all. If we try to find life from them, there's where the problem is. So, again, the person comes in to talk to us. Before they open their mouth, I'm sitting there thinking, okay, I know there's a common problem that we're going to be dealing with, which is sin. We're going to be dealing with their sins. And we're going to also be having to deal with the sins that were committed against them. But sin is the common problem. And I know this also. As a person walks into my room to sit on my couch, I'm sitting there thinking, they've abandoned God to one degree or another. They're not finding their life, identity, purpose, hope, etc., sense of being from God. And they have some empty wells in their life. They have some counterfeit ways that they are attempting to get what only God can give. I know this before they say their first word, because it's true for every one of us. So their empty wells are the counterfeit means of attaining for ourselves what only God can give. It's a substitute way, or a counterfeit way, to try to fill that God-shaped void within us. So the key phrase for the second verse of the Gospel of Wholeness is empty wells. So our broken cisterns are the empty wells that will never provide what only God can give, no matter how deep or how many we dig. Now, if we were to draw the diagram or a picture that would symbolize our lives, some of us would, and let's say we symbolize our life as a large field. Some of us would have a large field, and throughout the field there would be hundreds of these half-dug empty wells, because that's just the nature that some of us have. You know, we okay, I think I can find life and purpose from this. No, that's not working. Okay, now I'm going to try to find life and purpose over here. No, that's not working. Okay, education. I'll get my life and purpose from that. Oh, that's not working. And I'm going to get it from material things. And we just are constantly. We all know people like this. Maybe it's ourselves. We go through life constantly looking for that thing, that pursuit, that person, that object, that goal that we think is going to give us a sense of identity and value and worth. But we go from one to another, and they're just these little shallow wells that never get more than about a foot deep, you know? It's like a minefield, our life is, you know, of these empty wells. Now, there are others of us who, if we use that same field to diagram or to give a picture of our life, we would have in the center of that field the most beautiful, exquisite, well-dug, well-preserved well you could find. It has a little white fence around it, you know, and there's a nice gate there. And we planted pansies around the white fence. And as you come close and you look at this well, you notice a few things. It is deep. And the walls are well supported by teak wood, so there are no cave-ins. And there's one other thing that we notice about this wonderful well. We notice it's empty because it can't supply what only God can give. You see, some people will bounce from one pursuit, one goal to another, trying to find what only God can give. And there are others of us that our personality, our temperament is such that we're real perseverant. And we just have, you know, this well, I'm going to get water from it if it kills me. I'm going to find life. And we just really have created empty well digging to an art form. You know, it could be our career. You know, and we, you know, started out when we were 21 and we were in the mailroom, and now we're a VP, but eventually I'm going to be on the board of directors, and this is going to give me life in just a few more years, honey, and I'm going to find life from this career choice. And we've invested everything into it. Well, it doesn't really matter whether the person we're trying to help is a multiple well digger or a single well digger. It doesn't matter at all. What matters is we already know what? The wells are empty. They can't hold water. They can't provide life. Now this makes it a whole lot easier when we think about how are we, just normal Christians, how are we supposed to help people with all the different kinds of issues that people have these days. We have people with various addictions and eating disorders, and people with various kinds of depression and anxiety disorders and personality disorders, and how could we ever hope to help people? Well, the reason we have great hope to help people is because the scriptures make it very, very clear that the issue isn't so much what is their specific empty well. The issue is, do they know and do we recognize that it's empty? And our goal isn't to become the expert in all the different kinds of wells that are out there. The goal is just to become an expert in recognizing when they're empty. Okay? Now, to understand some about addiction, or to understand some things about depression or anxiety or hopelessness or whatever, it's fine if that understanding and that insight or that study can help you to convince the person it really is empty now and it's always going to be empty. But we don't have to become experts about the specific sin of choice. We just need to be experts about saying, that's where life comes from. We have abandoned God, who is the source of life. He is the spring of living water. And we have turned and we've dug our empty wells. And you know what? That's one of them. That's one of them. And so our goal is to simply help the people be willing to abandon their dry, empty well, and then, as we'll talk about later on, help the people very practically know how to reconnect with God, with Jesus, who is the provider of what they're trying to look for in the first place. In a great book called Finding God by Larry Crabb says this. He says, sin is simply our effort to supplant what we think are deficiencies in God's goodness. Let me read that again. Sin is simply our effort to supplement what we think are deficiencies in God's goodness. It's trusting in self instead of trusting in God. You see, the problem is we don't really believe that He's intending to give us life. We don't really believe that He's intending to give us peace and hope and purpose and identity and value and worth. So therefore, if we're not convinced He's going to give it to us, then we better go out and find it through our own means. And that's just sin. That's a picture and a definition of sin. Our way to try to supplement what we don't think God is willing to provide for us. What are some empty wells that we see in our culture? What are some empty wells you see? We've mentioned a few already. We've talked about work, career. Can be a wonderful empty well. What else?
Sometimes even the church worship service is so traditional and just the way we like it that it can be.
Sure. I mean, church and our involvement in church. In fact, service and ministry. Oh, ministry is a great empty well. Do you think there's ever any Christians out there who try to find their value and their worth, their purpose, their identity through ministry? Of course. And it looks so good, and it looks so spiritual. Now, does that mean ministry is bad? No. No more than career is bad. But if we try to find something from ministry, from service, from careers that only God can give, then it's counterfeit. Right? Ministry can be a tremendous empty well, and our involvement in the church. What else? Just call out some things. Pleasure, sure. You know, just pleasurable pursuits. You know, our activities, our toys that we have around us. What else? Relationships, that's a big one. We've all met individuals who have tried to find identity from another person. You know, you talk to them and all of a sudden you feel like they're trying to suck the life out of me. They're trying to get a sense of their own identity and value from me, and you feel like you're being, you're going to, cave in under the pressure. And all it is, having abandoned God, the source of living water, they're trying to find life through this relationship. And are relationships bad? No. But the problem is if you try to find life from what God has given for other purposes, that's where it's going to cave in. What else?
Education and knowledge.
Sure, education, knowledge. There are folks that, their ability to add more letters after their name, to get those degrees, to just become self-educated and know more and know more and know more. Knowledge can certainly become an empty well, a false basis of finding our own sense of purpose and value and worth and identity. What else? What? The occult certainly could be a more obvious empty well. Material things, just acquiring objects, a house full of beautiful things. I have worth, I have value, I have a sense of I am somebody because look, what I have. It makes me something. It's just an empty well.
Promotion. TV or reading.
Sure, activities like reading, TV, physical appearance. I mean, we can go on forever, couldn't we? If the enemy is out there saying, empty wells, anyone want any empty wells? I got plenty of them, and taking things that are so good, things that God has provided, and then just twisting it, distorting it, And instead of allowing us to enjoy relationship and enjoy learning and enjoy the material world and enjoy most all these things we were mentioning, the enemy can just twist that so we try to find life from it. You follow me? And what the world has done is it's taken each of these empty wells, and rather than calling it sin, what we do is we put nice fancy names on it. So the person who is trying to find life out of relationships, we don't say that, we don't call that sin or an empty well. What we say is it's codependency. You know, because it's a lot easier to say, you know, I have some problems with codependency than saying, hi, I'm a big sinner. You know, I mean, it flows better. You know, and rather than saying, you know, I am a drug abuser and an alcoholic or a drunk, what we say is, you know, I have an addiction. I have an illness. You know, it's just more comfortable than saying there's this sin here. And we have various, you know, I mean, everything either becomes an illness, you know, so we have eating disorders, rather than trying to find life and security from food or from the avoidance of food. You know, I can feel a sense of control over my life if I control what goes in my body, which is in part, at least at the core of things like anorexia and bulimia. We have people who are sinning by trying to find life through their careers, but we call them what? Workaholics. Sounds better than you know, sinners who try to find life from careers. You know, and so on it goes. But you see what we've done in our culture is we're trying to avoid the stigma and avoid talking about sin, and in so doing, we've lost the biblical hope of change. Because the Bible only talks about how to deal with sin. It doesn't talk about how to deal with all these other euphemisms. You know, now, what about the person who's depressed? I think the person who's depressed is oftentimes simply an individual who has tried to dig so many different empty wells only to find that they all are empty. Or maybe they've dug one beautiful, deep, wide empty well only to find out it too is empty. And what do? They just throw the shovel in the air and they sit down on the ground and they say, I give up. So I think much of depression is simply the result of individuals who have pursued the digging of empty wells, the attempt to find life apart from God, and they're in more reality than most of us, because at least they've come to the point where they say, this isn't working. You know, the rest of us who aren't depressed are just ignorant, you know, because we think, I think it is going to work. This time it's going to work. You know, at least the depressed person is you know, dealing with reality. Okay, so what is our job then? Our job is to help people identify and abandon their empty wells. Do we have to become experts in eating disorders, experts in addictions, experts in depression, experts in all these different areas? No, we need to be experts in saying any pursuit in which we try to find identity and value and worth and purpose, hope, and a sense of being apart from God is going to end up resulting in nothing. And it's a false, counterfeit, and empty pursuit. So we have to simply just help people see, do you understand that you're not getting what you want from this pursuit of yours, from this empty well? Do you think it might be a good idea to abandon it? And then we can, as we'll talk about this afternoon in particular, how do we practically help people to climb out of the well or away from the well and connect to God in a way that really does result in getting what they want. See, I don't want this just to be, you know, pie in the sky and you know, well, get people to turn to Christ. That's the key. Go for it, brothers and sisters. I mean, we'll be very practical this afternoon. And how do we practically teach others and ourselves to connect with God in such a way as to find greater and increasing sense of life that is purpose and identity and sense of being from Him. But it brings things down to ground zero, where no longer do we have to be intimidated by all the different problems that we have. I remember when I first became a pastor, this was back in the mid-'70s, and my wife and I moved to Columbus, Ohio, and you'd go to the bookstores, and you'd look in the self-help section, and back then there were like 7 books. There weren't a whole lot of self-help books. There weren't a whole lot of books on issues of psychology and so on. Now they have bookstores just for those books. It's just volume upon volume upon volume. It's the largest area in book publishing there is. These self-help books and self-improvement books. Because everyone is trying to find that new secret, that new way to deal with it. Now, there's a caution that we need to be aware of, and that is that we need to avoid inadvertently helping others to build empty wells. Because Christians in particular do that all the time. We are constantly, instead of helping them to identify and abandon their empty well, we're climbing down in it with them and trying to build it better. And let me tell you how we do it. When's the last time when a person came to you and you were talking to them and you could see they just didn't feel good about themselves and they didn't like themselves very much? And what do we do normally? We say, "Oh, Sally, I don't know why you feel so bad about yourself all the time. You are such a good cook." Or, "Joe, you do such a good job when you teach in that Bible study." Or Jane, you are so helpful and such a good mercy and extender and such a servant. I just appreciate you so much. And what we're doing essentially is saying, "Sally, you are such a good cook. Here, take a shovel." And Sally runs home and she thinks, "Oh, I'm a good cook. That's how I get my identity. That's how I get my value. I'll just do a lot more of it." Or I'm a Bible teacher. Is that where I get my identity? Okay, I'll do that more. I'll dig it deeper. So often, instead of a person who comes to us saying, I just don't like myself. I just don't know what I have to offer at all. What's my value? Why I'm not worth anything compared to other people. Instead of saying to them, "You're right. None of us have anything that we offer. None of us have life. None of us." It's true, isn't it? None of us, have our worth or a value or a sense of purpose because of what we do. We shouldn't. It's a counterfeit if we think that is how we're going to find it. So rather than saying, "Yeah, none of us have value," that's not why from within ourselves. None of us find our worth from what we do. We need to first have it, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't find gratification in these things, but that's not the source of it. The source of it is coming to learn how to hear Jesus speak into our lives, how to capture what He is saying of us and to us about the value and the worth that He has attributed to us, not from what we do, but just from what He says is true of us because we're His children. But oftentimes we end up, in a sense, helping them to dig those wells deeper. Helping a person who smothers a friend, for instance. Let's say that we talk to a person and they say, "I'm having problems and my friends keep on, just saying I'm overwhelming them, and they break the relationships off because I smother them, I just overwhelm them." And we say, "Well, let me help you with that. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to only call them once a week rather than every day. And rather than always talking about yourself, what you need to do is begin to ask them questions about them. And rather than just focusing so much in on this one person, I want you to begin to build other relationships with other people so you don't smother them." And you see, we're giving them good techniques, Don't call so much. Don't talk about yourself so much. Develop other friends. Now, is that good stuff? Yeah, that's fine. But we haven't dealt with the core issue, have we? We haven't said, I can give you some techniques that will help, but there's something beneath that. There's something more important that we need to talk about. And that is that I believe that you are trying to find what only God can give you through these relationships. Let's deal with that rather than learning how to build these relationships in a way that they won't cave in. Because that's all we're doing. The person comes to us, and what they are describing oftentimes is, my empty well is caving in. I'm trying to get life from the relationship, and the relationship is caving in on me. And rather than just saying, here, this is how you can prevent the cave-in, call less. This is how you can deal with your spouse being so upset with you because you're never home, by making sure you have a date night and making sure you're only working 65 hours a week rather than 70. Rather than just trying to fix the well from falling in on them, why don't we at least, in addition to that, say, maybe there's a fundamental issue here that would necessitate stepping out of the well for a moment and determining where are you finding life and peace and hope and so on. Does that make sense to y'all? Okay, let's just take a... Can you go on for about 15 more minutes before we take a break? Okay. Often an empty well is neither good nor bad in and of itself. The sin lies in our attempt to draw living water from that empty well. That should be clear. In other words, most of the things that we mentioned, there's nothing wrong with relationships. There's nothing wrong with career and work or education or service, ministry, possessions. It's what we're trying to get from those things. See, we're called to practice the presence of God. However, because of the fall, we no longer practice the presence of the Creator, but rather we practice the presence of the created. Jesus designed all of us to draw near to Him, to connect to Him, and to find a sense of self and life from Him. I can be at rest within myself because I'm connected to Jesus. And that's not some kind of just spiritual concept, but I've learned how to draw near to Him and receive from Him. That's what I want. That's what we all want. That's what we all need. And so the solution then for our dilemma as a human being living in a fallen world and having given over to the flesh and seeing sin run rampant is, Lord, I want to know how to practice your presence, how to come into your presence and enjoy you and find out from you who I am, rather than trying to find it, having abandoned you, trying to find it from your creation. So emotional healing and wholeness results when we're restored into a right relationship with God. But all too often, connection with God is seen as a result or a fruit of emotional healing, rather than understanding that it's the source of emotional healing. Do you understand the difference? We think that emotional healing is something so nebulous that that we can either pray into somebody, or we can they can become whole and happy and satisfied and at peace with life through external means or through some different techniques, rather than realizing that what brings healing and wholeness, stability, is coming to learn who we are and who Jesus is and what He says of us, and bringing that down to earth and making it practical. And I promise you, we'll make this real practical. It's not going to be just, go and find Jesus. Fall in love with Jesus more and more every day, and you'll be just fine. We're going to talk very practically how to make that connection. But that's essential. That's at its core. Spiritual wholeness, being who Christ has called us to be involves our recognition of these counterfeit ways that we've tried to attain what only God can supply. So, last night I talked a lot about how insight is sort of gives a false sense of healing. And indeed it does. If we think that just learning more about ourselves is the ultimate source of healing or wholeness. But insight can be valuable insofar as we can come to have insight into those empty wells that we've pursued. So there's no problem. A person who comes to us to talk and they may have a problem with the empty well of career, or the empty well of relationships, or the empty well of food, or whatever the case may be. What we can do is we need to give them enough insight to recognize this is a counterfeit way you're trying to find what only God can give. That's the insight that they need. They don't need to know all the ins and outs of anorexia or bulimia. They don't need to understand all the ins and outs of those who are workaholics. They don't need all the ins and outs. They don't need volumes and volumes on codependency or sinning by trying to find life from another relationship. What they need is simply to have the insight that I am trying to find from my friends, from these relationships, something that those relationships can't provide. And I need to abandon this dry well. We just need to convince them it's dry now and it's always going to be dry. That's the insight that they need. So do you understand why good biblical Christianity, biblical counseling, if you will, but it's just biblical Christianity, normal Christian living, we don't have to think that, only the experts can take care of this. Because I don't know enough about all these different diagnoses. Well, you know enough to know that they're empty wells very often. And you know enough to know how to help the other person recognize that, and as we'll talk this afternoon, how to get them to abandon it and what they need to be doing insofar as reconnecting to Christ. Now, too often, even the process of emotional healing becomes a new empty well, because we place our hope and our peace, even our identities, in the pursuit of wholeness rather than in our relationship with the Holy One. There are those, especially in our culture, and especially in our Christian culture, there are those who have made their pursuit of inner healing, or healing the child within, or emotional wellness, or whatever the phrase they want to use, they've made their pursuit of wholeness into their quest for life, their purpose for living. And each book they read and each bit of further insight they get makes them feel like I'm getting closer. And this pursuit of wholeness really becomes just a practice of navel gazing. It becomes an endeavor of introspection. And introspection is sin. Introspection is just one other empty well, where we think that gaining insight, coming to a greater sense of self-awareness, that's what's going to give me a sense of peace and life and wholeness and purpose. But self-awareness never is said to give us any of those things. When I used to live in Southern California, back when I was in Bible school, my roommate, he was the epitome of what I'm talking about. I mean, he went from one counselor to another, trying to get the secret of life and the secret of himself. And he would just, I remember the first counselor he saw fairly regularly, this counselor believed in what was called sensory deprivation therapy, and they would put him in this tank of lukewarm water, and with no sound and no light, and he'd just lay in there for an hour or two or something like this, and he's supposed to, as he's laying in this water, just to let all of his anxiety and all of his woes just float away from him, and he did that for a while until he began, having been in the tank so much, developing some kind of skin problems. So he had to stop with that, and then he went to this other therapist who was into primal scream therapy, and he'd go into, I don't know where he found all these guys. It was Southern California in the 70s, but he went into he'd go into these soundproof rooms, and and the counselor would say, now I want you to just scream from the depths of your soul and let out all the anxiety and let out all the tension. And he did that until he developed these nodules on his larynx. And so he had to quit that kind of therapy. And the final kind of therapy that last I had talked to him, this is years and years ago, he was trying, it was a rebirthing therapy where they would put him between two mattresses and sort of let him pretend he was being born, and they would deliver him. And I mean, the guy was like 6'3" and had hair all over him, and it was just kind of the picture that I get in my mind of this big coming out from the mattresses is kind of hard to take, but I don't know how that worked. But all this points to this notion in our culture in particular that we think that if we can look within, if we could dive within, if we could have enough inner understanding, that somehow then we're going to make this life work. But it is an empty well as well. And the key is, again, Christ is the source of life. He's the living water. And if we abandon Him and we turn, regardless of what we turn to, if we're trying to find life, worth, value, purpose, identity apart from Jesus, it will be empty. And as counselors, we need to really fight this tendency to encourage or to cause people to become introspective, to cause them to look within too much. And we'll talk a little bit this afternoon about this, but let me mention, lest I forget, I mean, there's a difference between self-awareness or between searching one's own self in a good biblical way, like David would, and introspection. Because the kind of insight or self-awareness that God would call for is when we look and discover things about ourselves with God as the tour guide, so to speak. We're like David, we say, Lord, search me and know me and show me any hurtful way. Lord, what do you want me to see? And the Lord is always more than willing to answer that question. That's healthy, that's appropriate. But introspection is when we are just diving within without God joining us at all, with this notion that if I could just figure what kind of animal I'm most like, and if I can just figure out who did what to me that caused me to feel what, and that in and of itself is an end that will bring about healing, then we've missed it. There is a place for dealing with issues from the past, and we'll talk a lot about that this afternoon. But it's not simply because insight or drawing things to the surface is going to fix us. That's where secular counseling works. Secular counseling has the assumption that if a person can understand enough, they will get better. If they can understand what makes them tick, they will then be able to change. And quite honestly, most, even Christian books, I believe, that are self-help books, usually it seems usually assume this is true as well. And that's why so many books, if you read them, they'll spend, if it's a 20-chapter book, they'll spend 19 and a half chapters talking about the symptoms, talking about the characteristics, talking about patterns, giving insight, and the last 4 or 5 pages, in summary, if you boil it down, says, try not to do that anymore. But they give a technique, but it really doesn't bring about or point to that kind of change that only God can produce. That's what we want. That's what the scriptures call for. By definition, Christianity is a supernatural religion, a supernatural relationship with a living God. So therefore, whatever we come to, whatever we look to as a solution for living in a fallen world, and the solution for what it talked about in Genesis chapter 3, 6 through 12, the solution has to involve the supernatural dynamic of relationship with a God who has chosen to have relationship and to be able to have interaction with us. So wholeness comes from abiding in Him. Knowing that He is the vine and we're the branches. And that apart from Him we can do nothing. That's the key. That's the core. That's what Jesus kept on saying. He didn't talk a whole lot about techniques. Deep breathing and, stand in front of a mirror and tell the mirror how good you are and how valuable. He talked about fix your eyes on me. Because I'm the author and the perfecter of your faith. And it strikes me when at Jesus' baptism, one of the few times where we hear the God the Father speak, what did He say? Behold my Son. Listen to Him. When God speaks up, He says, listen, look at Jesus. Behold Him. Fix your eyes on Him. Listen to Him. Because there's where we get life. There's where we get life. And again, this afternoon, this is all going to come down to earth where we get practical, where it's something that we can teach and we can learn. It's not something where we just have to say, okay, come and get close to Him and get close to me and wait for some experience. It is something that we can teach a person how to hear from God, how to listen to God, how to connect with God. It's something that we can teach, and we'll be making that very practical. So, let's review. The first verse in the Gospel of Wholeness is what? Genesis chapter 3, verses 6 through 12. 13, okay. Genesis 3, 6 through 13. And what's the key? The common problem, which is? Sin. Okay. Second verse in the Gospel of Wholeness is what? Jeremiah 2:13. Let's paraphrase that. We've all committed how many sins? 2. And what was the first? We've abandoned God. And why is that significant? Because He's the spring of living water. He's the source of life. He's a giver of life. Right? And what have we done? Having abandoned Him, what did we do? We've turned around and now we're digging these broken cisterns. And what's the key phrase of this verse, by the way? Empty wells, right? We're beginning to dig these empty wells. And why is that a problem? They're empty. They can't hold water. How about if we dig them a little bit deeper? Still empty. So we need to become experts at recognizing that's empty, but He's the spring of life. That's what we need to know. And then helping people to make that connection.